my dears, welcome to another video. What's up? How's it going? Today we are gonna do another debunking of my own work because learning and growing is fun and cute, and why wordlessly remove an outdated video from the internet when instead I can torture myself with it and teach you some things along the way. So welcome, I'm so glad to have you. Also for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a gray t-shirt with a what are colors? Wow. A green, purple, and white vertically striped shirt open on top, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I really need to start writing down my video descriptions before I film these rather than trying to figure out what I'm wearing on the spot. But anyway, about 3 years ago, I made a video that was titled The Evolution of Autism, the Solitary Forager Hypothesis. That was based on a really cool scientific paper that I had read that had been recommended to me. And this was back before I knew I was trans. This is back before I knew how to fix the autofocus issue on my camera. And also I was very depressed at this time. So just fantastic times all around. But this, much like my highly sensitive person video, which will be getting a remake in December, is a video from a while ago that I wanted to revisit and fact check a little bit. Well, the HSP video, I actually agree with all of my opinions. I just want to make it a little bit more academically sound. This one needs fact checking, and it's out on my list for quite some time, waiting for me to get around to doing that. And then a lovely video essayist named Mooncat appeared and kindly delivered a nearly 3.5 hour long deep dive into how evolutionary psychology is complete and utter pseudoscience. And I was like, wow, I'm so glad that I procrastinated this for that long because she just saved me a whole lot of time. And then it took me 4 full months to get around to watching that entire video. But now we're here. We're going to go through my original video. We're going to talk through a lot of stuff, and then I want to talk more about why I and others felt drawn to this particular research despite it being pseudoscience, and what we can learn from that. Because I think understanding why we, or at least I, wanted to believe a certain story is just as important as fact checking that story. So let us dive in. Also, in the old video, I did write this one down. My hair looks an absolute mess. I'm wearing a yellow dress that I remember to be very itchy with a navy sweater that's bright flowers embroidered on it, and I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom in front of some books and photos on the wall and also my bed there, and I'm woefully out of focus and I'm poorly lit. I will also be cutting some pieces of this original video altogether just for time's sake. Great. Hello my dears, and welcome to my new special interest. I am so glad to have you here to listen to me info dump about the coolest scientific paper I have ever read. I also fully acknowledge that a lot of the stuff in this video could, out of context, be used for eugenicist purposes. This is not the intention at all of this. We're going to talk a wee bit at the end about whether society is ready for this kind of research and if we can be trusted to do good with it. I talk all the time now on this channel about things that could be used for eugenicist purposes because there's a lot of nuance in a lot of disability conversations that if you just like took a small soundbite from it could be used to defend really bad things. But I do think that it's very funny for me to point out that in this specific situation, where the entire field of evolutionary psychology rests on the legacy of eugenics, so I kind of foreshadowed my own self with that one. Without further ado, today we are going to be talking about Dr. Jared Edward Rezer's 2011 paper, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, Conceptualizing the Autism Spectrum in Terms of Natural Selection and Behavioral Ecology, the Solitary Forager Hypothesis. And as somebody well-versed in social Darwinism, which is the use of evolutionary theories mixed with pseudoscience and eugenics and whatnot to justify racism, sexism, ableism, genocide, imperialism, etc. in history, I was very nervous when I started to read this paper, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. Not only because it wasn't eugenicist, which I guess is a pretty low bar to set, but whatever, but because I learned so much about myself and my relationship with the world. Again, while this particular paper may not feel particularly eugenicist to me as a reader at the time, the field in which it based much of its ideas on and sources throughout the entire paper very much is eugenicist, so we'll return to that. Now for some historical context, though it feels weird calling 2011 historical context, this is before the 2013 publishing of the DSM-5 and therefore the combination of the diagnoses of Asperger syndrome, autism, PDD, NOS, and a handful of other things. He also uses some functioning labels, which we don't really like to use in the community because of, well, their dehumanizing, ableist, and eugenicist qualities, and it does have some sexist, single-minded ideas of autism, but at the time of writing this, this was the acceptable view of autism, kind of the only view of autism, and it was most prevalent in the research at the time. So even though we may read that as offensive today, it was entirely acceptable at the time. And in most medical settings, it's still acceptable. When we think about a lot of movements like the civil rights and the LGBTQ+ movements and whatnot, we're always like, wow, it's wild how much has changed in 40 years. And then you look at disability rights and the neurodivergent movements and you realize it's wild how much has changed in the last
like 4 years, 10 years. We are changing the world before our very eyes, and it's really, really cool.
Honestly, I still stand by this. I think we can acknowledge a legacy of harm in something as it's outdated and also say, hey, this was the standard at the time, which doesn't make it okay, but also it doesn't mean we should villainize this person or automatically negate this work for being in line to where the field was at the time. We just need to acknowledge the historical context in which it came, which could be a slippery slope because some people use the like, it was a different time argument to justify things when most people knew better about that thing at the time that it happened, or at least the minority group that is being screwed over or taken advantage of very much knew that thing, and other people just kind of ignored that thing or didn't listen to them. But in specific cases, I'm willing to extend at least a little bit of grace, and this is still a case where I would more or less do that.
I have linked this paper, this is the best, in the description if you want to read it. I will be talking about almost every single piece of it, albeit a little scrambled in order to remove a few of the now debunked theories of autism.
And now 3 years later, I'm going to debunk the rest of it. How full circle of me.
So we're going to start with the basics of human evolution, which is a thing that you think you know until you really think about it, and then you go, wait, the only pre-ancient Egypt knowledge that I have is caveman, and that cannot be right. Which is true. We've all been there. Don't worry about it. So humans actually evolved into existence from a common ancestor with apes in southern and eastern Africa. We know that they began to travel places about 100,000 years ago because that's our most recent record of fossils in other places. Neanderthal populations were in the Eurasian area, and I cannot figure out or remember if they were part of the original group in Africa or not. But either way, the original group, upon traveling, pushed out and or bred in with the Neanderthals. If you know the answer to that, feel free to let me know in the comments, and overall, that's kind of all you need to know about that. Great. Okay, so the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BC, what even is time, is kind of cool because I always thought it was like, hey, I just figured out how to farm, let's tell everybody. But it was actually super gradual and was invented in several different places at once over a 5,000 year period. There are a bunch of theories as to why farming became the norm, but it was important because it meant that people could really create solid communities with hierarchies and religion and all of those kinds of stuff, which are what we consider to be innately human characteristics today. Now, overall, human evolution looked kind of like the coronavirus has, actually. It began at one spot, it migrated throughout the globe, and then it kept changing and adapting and evolving so that it could survive longer and make more of it, because that's how evolution works. Some kinds don't really make it and then they die out, kind of like the original corona did, and some really succeed and become the main one, like Omicron is doing. But because it's gone through so many changes, every single one is different and unique in its own way, while being still the same part of the same species. I don't think corona is a species. Whatever, you get the analogy. Another way to look at diversity in a species is how we have like a million different kinds of dog who all serve different purposes genetically. Like labs make great seeing eye dogs, Newfies are great swimmers, Cocker Spaniels are good at getting into everything, etc. There are a lot of differences between them, but they are all also dogs. So there you go, bam, evolution, great. If that made no sense, there's a crash course video on evolution that's probably a heck of a lot more helpful. I'll link that in the description, but also things will become clear as we continue, so don't you worry about it.
Pedagogically, using COVID as my example to explain evolution and adaptation was very smart, but also really caught me very deeply off guard and was a very wild choice. And when I first went through this, I giggled for quite some time. But I guess that was on everybody's minds, and most people were learning how it worked through that context, so it does track. And again, pedagogically, great decision, but whew.
Before we get into the autism bit, you should know that there are other examples of so-called disorders existing adaptively in other animals in the wild, and therefore are hypothesized to exist in humans for the same functional adaptive reason. Now, I've already downloaded all of these scientific papers, so if I am so inclined to continue this series once I'm like doing school stuff, I will continue it, but I will also link them for you. I also should mention that saying something, whether a disorder or a mental illness or natural human variation or anything else, is adaptively advantageous does not mean that it is a great experience in the society that we currently live in. It may not have even been great to experience in the wild either. We have no way of knowing that. But by saying that anxiety shows a careful, cautious strategy, which is advantageous for survival in the wild, I'm not saying that having an anxiety disorder is good or fun or ideal. I'm just saying that it was very useful at one point, just like an appendix or a tonsil. And to some extent, it may also be useful today, because if you weren't anxious about driving, you would just be a reckless driver. Sometimes our brains just go a little overkill. It happens. We've also seen that depression shows a socially submissive strategy. Schizophrenia shows a defensive, vigilant, and impulsive strategy. Psychopathy is a socially selfish, opportunistic strategy. PTSD is threat avoidant. And the most commonly cited one, ADHD, as a hunter in a farmer's world, since high levels of activity and scanning and all of that stuff helps to notice threats and immediate opportunities, which one must impulsively get or they will be lost. So they make great hunters. There are also some flaws in all of these theories, of course, but it is important to talk about them because A, they help us to understand that, well, we're not defective, and that's really important to know. B, they help us to understand our behaviors, tendencies, and figure out how to make the world more welcoming to us. And C, they remind us that, well, humans are just like any other animals in the world. Like, we may be different, but we're not necessarily special or evolved out of our animalness. We just happen to wear clothes. We're just... I personally believe that humans have a serious superiority complex that we really need to work on. It's not helping anyone. It's not helping the world.
Where to begin? First of all, psychopathy and sociopathy are not things, so that being used as an example is a red flag. I did take that directly from the paper, but I still stand by that. I also took socially submissive from the paper, and I hate that phrasing, and I'm sorry that I literally ever said those words in my entire life. Second of all, something existing in the gene pool does not necessarily mean that it was ever an advantageous thing. It might just be there. Maybe it's not disadvantageous enough to be sorted out. Maybe it's a side effect of something else that is super advantageous. Maybe it's just a deeply complicated thing that has a huge amount of factors involved in a genetic sense, in an environmental sense, in a combination between genetics and environment, and thus there's no universe where evolution could even bother to touch that. And also, something does not need to be advantageous to be a thing that exists. It could be super random. Like, yes, generally, evolution is a thing that happened. I don't like how I said that, like I'm questioning that. Evolution happened. It is happening. Generally, the traits that best fit to their environment and place in the food chain and whatnot are the things that will probably stick around more, but we shouldn't be thinking about it like it's a precise equation, because it's more of like a generalized pattern than anything. It's not like every species is a perfect piece in the puzzle. It's more like they're a shape that mostly fits there, so good enough. And also, evolutionary psychology kind of assumes that human evolution was perfected during the caveman times and then nothing has changed about humans since then. And it also assumes that deviance from the norm is an error to be corrected rather than the norm, with the perceived norm being just a very general average of all of the things. Which even Darwin wrote about the fact that a norm for a species is actually a more generalized, statistically, they're all kind of like this situation rather than everybody is the exact same thing. Also, evolutionary psychology relies on the idea that psychological and personality traits are all things that are in your genetics, which is both probably not a thing, and also, either way, not sure enough of a thing to base an entire scientific field on top of, because that's a very large assumption to make, and then make other assumptions on top of the other assumptions. But really, doesn't every psychological debate end up boiling down to nature versus nurture under a completely different title? I feel like we shouldn't be surprised at this point. The A, B, and C as to why it's important to talk about these theories is something that we're going to unpack later.
What does this mean in the context of autism? The prevalence of autism in the population is high enough to suggest that it was, if not is, a useful phenotype, but also low enough to suggest that autism wasn't always preferable. By the way, a phenotype is what your genes express as, i.e. you have brown eyes, so your genes may show that you have brown and blue eyes, but you only see the brown eyes because they're the dominant gene. If you want to learn more about this, Google Punnett squares, it'll explain everything for you.
Yes, but also two things to note. First, Punnett squares are the very, very basic understanding that you learn in 10th grade biology because they're the very basic 10th grade biology understanding of things. Kind of like how when you're in 3rd grade, you learn how to divide and then you just add the remainder at the end of it, and then in like 6th grade, probably earlier than that, I don't know, I'm not paying attention to that kind of pedagogy, but you learn about decimals existing, right? Like we learn things in baby steps. Punnett squares are the baby step. One of the most common Punnett square examples that you use in your 10th grade biology class is eye color, but actually there are about 16 different genes that are responsible for eye color. So an actual real life Punnett square is gonna have a lot more squares in it than you're just like, 2, blue and 2 brown, and then you come up with a different, that's not how that works. Also, Mendelian genetics more generally doesn't work for a massive chunk of traits in a large number of species, so That's a thing. Also, a gene is not a super specified thing. It's more of a concept, and a lot of scientists have different opinions as to what precisely that means. And many will now use words such as DNA elements or coding sequences instead of saying gene to separate this idea that we've had for a while around the omnipotent gene that controls everything in humans. Like, everybody thought that the 2003 Human Genome Project was going to just fix everything and give us all the answers to everything. And what instead came out of it was scientists going, wow, we know way less than we thought that we did. What's most interesting to me about my video in particular is that I think I was working on my eugenics video that came out 2 weeks after this one at the same time that I was writing this one, in which I talk about how Punnett squares are a hypersimplification for educational purposes. So I don't know how that didn't make it into this one, or if I got my wires crossed, or if I just finished this video and then I started the other. I don't remember, but anyway.
So we know that the prevalence of autism in the population is significantly higher than common mutation rates, and that means that these genes must have given some sort of advantage in the ancestral environment. We also know that it is highly heritable and associated with a number of both genetic and environmental risk factors. AKA, we know that autism is somehow related to how our genes are passed down to other generations, which is how we know it's an adaptation, because it continues to be passed down. So it proves that it must have had some use at some point, if not now.
No, it doesn't. That doesn't prove anything at all whatsoever, because again, evolution isn't perfect, and a lot of not so great and super neutral things also ended up existing as part of variants within our species. Does science generally think that autism at least is to some degree heritable? Yes, that is true. But do we know what specifically about it is heritable? Unclear, but it's definitely very complicated and has many different pieces involved, if only because the amount of comorbidities that usually come along with it probably are more heritable, but then not everybody has those comorbidities, so there are even more different factors. And at the end of the day, the search for the autism gene, if that search is even happening, I guarantee you that it is, but I don't want to know about it. It's not something that I think should be going on for a large number of reasons, eugenics being the top of that list. That's a side tangent. The point of me pausing here is that something existing in the population at higher than a common mutation rate does not mean that said trait was an advantage. That's a large leap to make. And in my defense, that was a leap that the paper made itself and not my own opinion, but still, very large leap. But there's also not enough genetic or neurological research to have any definitive claims on why, how, and where this happens. We will talk about what we know about the brain in a wee bit. We also know that autism is equally prevalent in all studied races and ethnic groups, which leads scientists to think that these traits were likely fully developed before we left Africa. Or, like we saw with the agricultural revolution, could have evolved in several places at once around the same time. Scientists are still not sure if autism is better explained by rare mutations or by rare combos of common genetic variants, especially because we know that many other developmental disorders and or rare comorbidities like Rett syndrome and Fragile X syndrome, for example, may present the same traits or exacerbate those traits. Even the external differences between autism and ADHD can be super difficult to tell, even for experts. And we don't have nearly enough genetic information to be able to sort which ones are a clear picture of the adaptation and which are not. Also, why is this important? But sure, whatever. I would agree. Why is this important?
Let's talk about some brain stuff. Yeah. Also, just keep a lot of these things in mind that I'm about to say as we go forth, because they're going to start to make a whole lot more sense pretty soon, but I felt like it was important to get the basic biology down first. So, the most cited autistic trait in diagnostic criteria at least is social deficits, and we can very clearly see that with brain scans. Different regions of the brain that are associated with social cognition, like the amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, orbital and medial frontal cortices, and the mirror neuron system are significantly different in autistic people in comparison to allistic or non-autistic people. Also, if you don't know what any of those big brain words mean, that is totally okay. They really don't matter. You don't need to know them. I'm just including them for the neuro nerds who wanted to know what they are so that you don't ask me in the comments.
Former Sydney did put social deficits in quotation marks in the script, but that I still should have taken a moment there to point out that a social deficit is a very subjective term, and maybe calling it deficits isn't the best thing in the entire world. Second thing, let's talk about brains and brain scans real quick. A can of worms I don't want to open too much, but I will say that studies that rely on fMRI scans are some of the main things brought up in discussions around the research replication crisis, because fMRI studies that measure brain activity in certain areas will generally give you a general idea of an average of where things probably are taking place in the brain, but they also vary significantly for individual people between trials and often get different results from the same people the second time that they scan them. In this particular case, I read all of the papers that he is referencing here. They are all from the neuroscience side and more focused on structure than on activity, so that is not a particular red flag to me, but fMRIs often are in research, research, so I point out anyway, and we will discuss a different one later on. But the one thing I do want to point out, however, is the fact that all the studies he is citing about this are about a decade old by the time that he's publishing this paper, which to me feels old when in the vein of both autism and neuroscientific research, because they're both moving very quickly. I feel like they're probably should have been more recent papers available, but also if you're looking at one paper from like 2006 to source it, and then it quotes back to some older papers, you're bound to end up following that vein of thought to the end. So I do get how that could have happened, but I would consider half or more than half of his sources to be on the older side, which is again, just kind of interesting to me. I also wanted to point out that in the original paper, the language here talks about brain abnormalities in autism rather than brain differences, which is an interesting language choice since the paper tries to market itself as being very focused on humanizing autistics and explaining why we exist while still using primarily deficit-based language. Which again, might be the time in which this was written, but like, the idea of using atypicality is not super recent in my experience, so I just think it's interesting.
We also see that there is clearly impaired facial processing across the board, as well as reduced affect, i.e. your facial and tonal expressiveness. The facial motor nucleus and the fusiform face area are reduced in autistic people. We've also been shown to have increased fear activity in the amygdala, and our hippocampi, which are integral to our spatial abilities and knowledge, tend to be significantly larger in autistic people. There's also a neuropeptide, which is kind of like a neurotransmitter like serotonin or dopamine, called oxytocin, which is thought to enhance social learning, social expressiveness, direct eye gaze, and facial memory and recognition, which is significantly reduced both in its existence and in receptors for it in autistic people. What's interesting about this is that the more social a species is, the more receptors for this neuropeptide and the more of it the species tend to have in their brains.
Again, language. I do also want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here and point out the fact that impairment isn't inherently bad or negative or horrible, it's just a fact of life and a thing that exists. So this bothers me a little bit less than abnormalities and deficits, but given the fact that he used that other language, I know what tone the usage of impairments is here and what it's meant to be, which is not my favorite. And also, again, same conversation as above about brain things to some degree. A lot of this could be a confounding situation where they just see these correlations, but they're not actually indicative of the precise situation at hand. Also, that specific study around the fusiform face area, while from 2008, so it was quite recent in regards to when this paper was published, only tested on children and only took data from 11 autistic participants and 11 non-autistic participants, which, needless to say, is a very small sample size. And this particular study was also an fMRI brain activity measure, which we talked about above, so to me, again, that feels like a very large claim to rest on a very teeny tiny spot of data.
The last part of the brain stuff that really blew my mind was macrocephaly, aka when somebody's head circumference is atypically large. And the thing is, I've heard about this being related to autism and went, but then I moved on because it didn't make any sense. So macrocephaly is common in young autistic kids. The prevalent rate is about 10 to 15%, but to be diagnosed, it has to be 2 or more standard deviations from the mean, which is a lot. So autistic children could, on average, actually have larger heads than the regular population, but we just don't have enough data for that information yet. I shouldn't have to say this, but please don't go around measuring children's heads and guessing who's autistic. Don't do that. But anyway, because of this, our brain growth is accelerated in early autism. We are ahead in brain growth until about age 4, where the maturation slows prematurely, though I would assume that it would not be premature if it also started earlier, but sure. At the end of the day, our heads end up tending to be about the same size as non-autistic people or allistic people later in life, so it does even out. We've also spoken before about how the most common theory of autism is the apoptosis theory. Apoptosis meaning natural cell death, that autistic people don't experience the natural pruning of useless neurons and neuronal connections, which gradually reduces the amount of sensory input that a person can take in over time as they become more autonomous and less likely to, be eaten by a vulture at the same rate or amount as it does for allistic people, which is really interesting. And I think that these two things honestly fit together quite nicely. We're born with extra neurons and extra connections. We mature faster, so there's going to be a lot less apoptosis because there's just more stuff going on in the brain at one time. And so we're also going to have more sensory stuff going on and also bigger heads. In the literal sense, not the metaphorical sense. So why do we experience precocious maturity? Well, scientists think that human childhood takes so long because we are such a social species, and social interactions are more variable than ecological ones, so it takes more time to learn and develop as a being. And less social species tend to have shorter childhoods, i.e. their offspring are out of the nest and living on their own earlier, so their brains need to be developed earlier. Again, keep this in mind, we'll return to it. Now, there used to be this theory that autism was a version of the extreme male male brain and that autistic people have more testosterone than allistic people. This was, of course, based on the fact that the diagnostic criteria at the time exclusively diagnosed copy-paste versions of Sam from atypical, and the prevalence of autism was 4 times more common in people assigned male at birth, which we now know is not true because autism is not just Sam from atypical, and the diagnostic criteria are currently changing to be more inclusive, which is really, really great. But the dude who published that study did have some great and probably more accurate things to say about the autistic brain. Well, okay, I just want to point out that the diagnostic criteria haven't actually changed that much. Practitioners are just learning how to see different presentations of autism than young white boy who like trains. I also don't know why I'm in theory defending Simon Baron-Cohen there, the author of the Extreme Male Brain Study, because his later research is also not super beloved by the autistic community. I think he did some cool things by changing how people saw autism at the beginning, and also now we can handle it without him, actually, now that we have Own Voices research. So I do take back my defense a little bit there. I don't think that was warranted. There is one more kind of debunked thing, but it's kind of right, but it's mostly debunked. And that is the theory that autistic people have impaired empathy. As we've talked about before, 50% of autistic people have alexithymia, which I pronounce alexithymia in my video about it, but it's alexithymia, which is the inability to recognize or describe one's emotions. And that, in combination with the fact that we often don't express what we're feeling in our faces the way that allistic people tend to do, that made people think that we don't experience empathy at all. We do know that autistic people do struggle with theory of mind, or the idea of understanding what is going on in somebody else's head. Impaired. I just want to take a moment to clarify my take here a little bit. The myth that all autistics do not have / feel empathy has been sort of colloquially replaced lately with, actually, autistics feel too much empathy, they just express it differently, when it very much lies somewhere in the middle of both of those things, and also both of those things are very vast generalizations. Empathy is a very complicated creature. It's also something that I would argue is not super measurable and is a more of a subjective concept to begin with. And also, people who do not experience empathy or who experience it differently are not any less human or kind or good or lovely as anybody else is, and I just want to make that super, super clear. I will also add that I think varying levels of empathy is just a human thing that is not autism specific. People just read it as autism specific because flat affect is a piece of the stereotype of what we imagine autism to look like, and that has been intertwined with empathy for forever, but it is a much wider concept and situation than that. And this theory came along with the idea of systemizing, which is the ability to observe a physical system and make inferences or conclusions about how it works and what causes it to work the way that it does. It's a skill that is relatively useless in the sense of moment-to-moment changes in a person's behavior, but it is really super useful for problem solving and, in the wild, tool construction and use, which explains the whole theory of mind thing pretty decently, honestly. The paper then went on to talk about the hypothesis that autistic people are meant for engineering, science, and math, which, in my opinion, is pretty narrow-minded because some of the greatest artists and musicians and writers of all time have also been autistic, but this theory is very much in line with the Sam from atypical is the only definition of autism situation that still kind of exists. And it did cite some really interesting examples actually from a 2006 study that students in the natural sciences have a higher number of relatives with autism than do students in the humanities. And that fathers and grandfathers of autistic men are twice as likely to be engineers compared to males in the general population. Which does make sense if you think of the stereotype of the nerd or the absent-minded professor in our society. And now I've been called an artist with the mind of a scientist, but I truly believe that all of these disciplines are very much intertwined. Not to mention that there are more versions of autism than the Bill Gates version, which was kind of the only one considered to exist at the time that this theory was published in 2006. I more or less agree with this analysis, but I will add to clarify that scientists are probably more likely to get diagnosed, at least historically, because first of all, they're closer to science, obviously, and also the arts handles the concept of mental health completely differently. So that 2006 study is sort of a moot point, in my opinion, unless they were measuring for autistic traits rather than a diagnosis of autism. But even that would not quite work because claiming autism as a diagnosis is a lot more complicated than just going down a checklist of traits. I would also argue that different aspects of traits that one may associate with autism are traits that are trained and desired in particular fields, like a level of hyperfocus and rule following in the sciences versus a level of mimicry, observation, and social norm rejection
perfection in the arts. So you really can't just like argue that one side is more autism heavy than the other without really clear parameters that balance that on both sides.
But the idea of systemizing is super important for this study. It explains why autistic people tend to prefer solo learning and figuring out stuff themselves. And it makes sense why in the wild that would be a really great adaptation. You can problem solve and think creatively and innovate in ways that other people in your group and community likely cannot. And sure, your social ability may not be perfect, but keep in mind that conformity is a fairly recent trend, just in the last 5 to 10,000 years, which seems like a lot, but like in time, it's really not. Food and home used to not rely on social ability, and being quirky and weird and different used to be way more acceptable than it really is today. Now, what happens when you take a systemizer out of the wild and then you put them into everyday 21st century life? Well, for one thing, we're gonna obsess over socially meaningless activities because the energy that we typically use for obsessing over food and learning everything about plants so that we know the benefits of each one, well, that energy now has nowhere to go, which means that instead we learn an excessive amount about anything else that may interest us. A core thing to know about animal behavior is that animals habituate, or get used to, uninteresting things pretty darn quickly, and then they systemize things that they find rewarding and interesting. Whether that's through interest in the thing, or social clout, or comfort, or food, what have you, depends on the person. So perhaps autistic people in prehistory just saw social stuff as completely meaningless and hunting and gathering to be quite interesting and rewarding. And if you don't do any of the social activities for generations, well, you don't need those social skills. Autism is also commonly connected with savant syndrome, or splinter skills, which are a proficiency in systemizing a particular system that was elaborated on and embedded through generations. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups say that those they observe have cultivated amazing naturalistic abilities and are able to sense and perceive things to which they are virtually blind, such as tracking, stalking, food processing, mapping of terrain, knowledge of flora and fauna, edible versus inedible species, prey habits, understanding of self-protection, maximized efficiency of food collection, tool fashioning, and shelter procurement. Also, I might mention that autistics are well known for their superior pattern recognition. So who do you think is going to notice that all of the bunnies appear on the far left of that hill when the sun is 2/3 the way down the sky? Or step in poison ivy and then suddenly figure out what every other poison-oiled plant looks like? Or have an atypically good inner map of the area? You guessed it, that's the work of your autistic friends, even in prehistory. Without us, gosh, who knows what they would have done.
This is very interesting to me because that phrasing that I just said is technically Aspie supremacy to some degree. Aspie supremacy being the belief that like, autistic people, particularly low support needs autistic people, are superior to other people, whether that means neurotypical allistic people or higher support needs to medium support needs autistics, which is unfair and uncool and bad. And this idea that it's like, oh, well, you couldn't have functioned without us because we're so important, I think is a valid thing to want to feel, because we're told that we're wrong all the time, and so it's easy to overcorrect into like, this is a superpower and this is what makes me special. And there's an in-between ground that's kind of important that I did not talk about here. And the idea of just like, oh, the allistics wouldn't have survived without the autistic people, I don't think is a super fair or okay take to be making. So I just throw that out there as well.
Now, there's no direct evidence or academic literature on these kinds of behaviors or autistic traits, but as we've seen in many of my breakdowns of literature and history, we do know that autism is a natural variant today, and it has always existed. People just haven't really been looking for it or had a word to even try to look for it. Now, let's talk about orangutans. This is related, I promise.
I'm not gonna say that this is all bad, but what I will say is that it is all just theory laid on top of theory laid on top of theory that's making a very large amount of assumptions. So then the larger question is not, is this true or is this plausible, but rather, why does this matter? Why do we feel the need to make all of these conclusions and assumptions? And we're gonna hold on to that, and we're gonna come back to it later.
So, orangutans are genetically third closest to humans, and they are solitary in the wild, meaning that they hunt and forage and live by themselves. When infants are with their mothers, they learn about survival and reproduction, but not socialization or communication. Well-defined communities of orangutans do not appear to exist in any orangutan population thus far studied, and they can be best described as cautious, introverted, limited social aptitude, they tend to prefer solitude, they have low interaction and association rates, and they often only meet up with others to mate or just happen to be near each other when they're eating from a particularly good tree. And before you say, Sydney, you're comparing autistic people to apes, this is offensive, I'm out. I'm going to compare allistic people to chimps in a hot second, so just hang in there. Also, we're just all animals, roll with it. Okay? Okay. So orangutans are the only ape without socialization. Why? Well, their habitats have a low food density compared to all other apes, and in all species of the world, food density of habitat directly correlates to animal group size. As soon as food becomes scarce, many social animals will actually split up and go and search for food alone. And this is what happened to orangutans. Orangutans and chimps have the same common ancestor, but chimps, who have a decently large food density where they live, tend to stay together in massive groups. Their brains tend to have more oxytocin receptors, higher oxytocin levels, and a larger fusiform face area and facial motor nucleus, and they're always socializing. They use eye contact and large facial expressions for communication within their groups. Now, orangutans, on the other hand, well, they moved to Southeast Asia and food was scarce, so they had to split up. The ones who could best handle being completely alone or in very small groups and were most attuned to their surroundings were the ones that survived long enough to reproduce, and over time they ended up becoming an antisocial species. Even chimps, when food is scarce, will split up temporarily to search for food. So what happened to humans during the ice ages or when they lived in harsh and unpredictable climates? Well, groups had to disband to survive. Those who could handle being on their own in the wild best were the ones to survive and reproduce, creating your solitary foragers. And if this happened in complete isolation in one region for a while, you'd have a completely autistic species.
Yikes. So there is an interesting thing to branch off of this about autism and how it is fundamentally a social situation and therefore very culturally specific, which creates a situation where, like, Italian autism probably looks a lot different from American autism because the cultural social norms are different in those different cultures. Like, when I was in Italy, certain things about how I interact with the world that are barriers here, that are clashes here, were just the norm there, and that was fantastic, but I was met with a completely different set of challenges that I'd never dealt with when I was here. And also they were accommodated more because people were expecting there to be culture clash, so it was actually sort of easier to be autistic in that situation than it is here. And I think that is a very interesting conversation. I have seen other autists, especially on social media, bring this conversation up in perhaps some of the least careful ways possible, because you can't just be like, this culture is autistic, in the same way that you can't say a species is autistic, because a huge part of the diagnostic criteria for autism involves a clashing with the social norms, which change based on culture and community. This is a very complicated and nuanced discussion that usually leads me into an existential crisis, so we're not going to touch it here. I just thought that I would bring it up. Also, as fun as it is to learn about the social norms of orangutans, while I think humans need to recognize that we are animals more than we socially do typically, we also need to recognize that when we talk about the social norms of the species, we are inherently looking at them through the lens of the culture in which we live, and will thus never be able to truly understand or explain the in-depth nature of their culture because of our inherently anthropomorphic bias.
Now, you may be thinking, okay, but like non-autistic people could handle the wild too. And that is true, they definitely could. But if you've ever seen Tom Hanks's movie Castaway, you know, that's the one with the volleyball named Wilson, who's like his only friend on the island. Yeah. So humans are, as I've said before, an inherently social species, which means that a lot of people really cannot survive without any kind of companionship. Some are fine entirely alone, some are fine with only animals as friends, but for people who naturally seek out physical contact and emotional relationships, solitary life could have been miserable or even unbearable. Not to mention that, as we saw in Castaway, having an imaginary friend takes up a lot of time and energy, and that would be evolutionarily maladaptive because, well, you'd be spending less time working on your own survival. Without as much theory of mind or need for companionship, you can only focus on the survival things that you need, so there's less displaced and confused behavior.
Again, something being maladaptive does not mean that it just gets taken out of the gene pool. Evolution is not that precise. Like, do you know how many absolutely silly goose adaptations various species do that are completely counterintuitive to their survival and well-being? Because there are far too many for us to keep believing that evolution got everything perfect and solid all the time with every single species.
Life as a lone hunter-gatherer was also very much predicated on routines and sameness, which for autistic people is how we like it. I eat the same meal and I follow the same schedule pretty much every single day, and I absolutely love it. But for a lot of allistic people, that sameness would completely drive them mad. Alternatively, the other way around can actually do the same thing. You may have heard stories throughout history of so-called feral children, abandoned children who survived to adulthood in the wild, and most of the time when people try to culture them and put them into everyday society, they completely broke. Many of them figured out how to run away and get back to the forests rather than try to stay in this new world. Oh, and the ones that we do know of, well, they all showed mostly autistic traits because those were protective and adaptive responses to solitary life. It's likely that many other abandoned children didn't make it because, well, they didn't have the ability to survive without any human companionship. We also see this behavior actually in solitary animals when placed into unnatural and confining environments. They act like they have really severe autistic burnout. They engage in perseverative and repetitive behaviors, including self-injurious behaviors, which are incredibly rare in the wild, but very common in captivity. The higher intelligence of that animal, the more that they do self-injurious behaviors because they need a more stimulating and motivating world than the one that they are currently placed in. So if an autistic person says they feel like a tiger in a cage, you're not really wrong, actually.
I don't think this is a binary autistic versus allistic thing, nor should we act like it, because some allistic people also really like sameness. Some autistic people really hate sameness. Some people, regardless of neurotype, tell themselves they like sameness because it means they have control over things, but actually secretly deep down it makes them miserable and they do crave difference. Also, did they show autistic traits, or did they show traits we perceive as being autistic, particularly because they're being psychologically studied and analyzed to a very high degree and we're sort of dehumanizing them? Also, cannot imagine that the experience of those children was very trauma-informed or pleasant, and that does not mean they're incapable of adapting, they just may have not been given the tools to do that on their own terms. I mean, the tiger in a cage metaphor still stands. I still use that frequently, but the rest of it, questionable.
Now, it's important to note that humans may not have been entirely solitary creatures. They could have foraged alone and then reconvened intermittently, or foraged in small groups. There's no specific literature on solitary foraging in humans, but we were known to split briefly when food was scarce, and were known to live in relatively small groups that fluctuated greatly in size. So the amount of social skills one would need for survival in any given group was completely different and selectively chosen by necessary pressures, which explains a large variation in social abilities and the extremes of function and dysfunction that we have today. Now, what happened to autistic people born into solid communities that didn't need to split up? Well, I mean, sure, it was definitely a mismatch, but most adaptations have a risk to benefit ratio. They reflect trade-offs that, over evolutionary time, produce on average more benefits than cost. So an autistic person could have gone off nomadically from the group, or they could have foraged alone and then returned to interact and travel. They also could have been just a highly valued member of a community for their innovation and skill, or even not even noticed as something different. Like I said in my changing video, there was a lot of, well, he doesn't talk, but he's great at herding sheep, and he's a decent guy, so we're just rolling with it. Or he's really weird, but he's also a genius, so we're just gonna vibe with it. And she doesn't really speak, but she fulfills her duties leading a household perfectly, and she raises children quite well. And there's been a lot of that in human history. Also, all autistic people are not a monolith, obviously. Many of us really like having friends, just quality over quantity, which may have been perfect in a smaller nomadic group. Now, the question is, did autism evolve among allistics or within its own isolated population? Well, it could have been some small subspecies of solitary foragers that ended up merging with ours from an ecologically/climatologically different region, kind of like the Neanderthals once did. Another example of this, kind of more modernly, is the pygmy phenotype that evolved independently in South American, African, and Southeast Asian populations of humans in the last 200,000 years. It is categorized by small human body size, and we know that children with mixed pygmy and non-pygmy genes are a spectrum of height. And that gene stays in the population for a really long time. So because of that, we now know that populations can evolve specific genes that vary markedly from the norm and do it pretty darn fast, and that it can happen in several places at once. And when assimilating, their genes last a long time in the greater population. Another interesting example he brought up in this paper was skin color. Completely different genes in different areas of the world cause populations farther from the equator to develop lighter skin, but even within very isolated populations, there's still a ton of variation in skin tone. So there is not only so much difference in every single human, but also so much indistinguishable genetic difference from absolutely all over the place, because every single environment needs a slightly different set of traits and skills for optimum survival, which is really incredibly cool. Not just the autism bit of it, but also just the whole understanding humanity portion of it. So, all in all, autism is a natural human variation, which is what disabled people have been saying for years, but hey, now we have a lot of science about it. That's super great. I feel so incredible about myself and a lot more solid in my identity now, so yay for that. Yeah, and I would argue that actually that's a problem here, but we're gonna unpack that later. I think it's crucial to point out that the examples this dude brought up about the evolution of things are all
physical phenotype examples. Height and skin color are things that are genetic, and we're pretty solid on that. But we have very little confirmatory or solid evidence about the impact of genetics on somebody's personality and brain function, and we should not be pretending that those two concepts are completely interchangeable. Again, we find ourselves arguing nature versus nurture, where evolutionary psychology in general, and thus this paper, implies it's entirely nature, which is just not based on any of the facts of the matter. But anyway, let's talk about the implications of what we've just learned. My first thoughts while reading this was wondering about the autistic traits that weren't mentioned, such as over-the-top facial expressions or over-the-top affect and over-empathy. So I did a wee bit of research and discovered pretty quickly that those are super common responses to trauma. Obviously, there is no way of knowing if somebody who behaves that way in our society would necessarily behave that way in the wild, or whether they would become caveman Sam from Atypical, but it's an interesting thought. My second thought was I would be so useless in the wild and I would overload so quickly. So then I started to think and realize that I don't have panic attacks when I'm in nature, unless there's another human doing something weird. I also feel a lot safer in the wild. There are no really loud mechanical noises. Even things that go crash boom are typically more textured sounding, like a tree falling down. Fluorescent lights don't exist, and you can eat and do the same thing every day. It's completely not a problem, and you can choose to only socialize with animals if you want. Overactive senses is not what makes you shut down in the middle of a Joanne Fabrics, but rather something that keeps you from being attacked by a bear in the wild. When I was in quarantine the first 2 weeks of college last spring, I went days without speaking and I moved at my own pace, and I was the happiest and also the most physically healthy I think I have ever been, because, well, I had enough energy to do the things that I wanted to do. Not that life in the wild would have been perfect. I'm not going to become a nomad or whatever. I like my life, but I think that it would actually be a very good place for me to be in theory. What a fun thing to come back to. Let's talk about hindsight. Mostly that, yes, I was the happiest I'd ever been because my life before the time had been a bit of a hot mess. Also, living a life of complete solitude like that was not very sustainable. I convinced myself that I loved it because suddenly I was in control over a lot of things in my life for the first time, and that was what I liked. But I also, in that time, overworked myself to a very high degree, probably was not the greatest friend to other people, spiraled a lot, just moped a lot, didn't exercise very much, and yes, I did feel better than I had in a very long time, but that was because I was controlling my triggers for the first time, so I suddenly wasn't sick 24/7, I was sick like a third of that time. And even if I was happy back then, it does make me sad to look back on that as one of my happiest times, because life is so much more than that. And I think when something feels safe and in control, it's easy to get caught up in this cycle where you convince yourself that it's therefore great and you like it, even though you're kind of really sad and lonely, which I was at that time. So actually, I redact that because now I'm living in a very overwhelming and loud city where every single day looks completely different from the other days before me, and I'm completely infinitely happier and more connected with other people than I have ever been at any other time in my life. Because liking alone time a lot does not equate to a necessity to be alone all the time, and there is very much a balance to be had there. I was also thinking about how I feel most safe and comfortable when I'm in nature, though I've also really been interested in the fairly recent idea of nature deficit disorder, which theorizes that human beings, especially children, are spending significantly less time outdoors, and the belief that this change results in a wide range of behavioral problems and why those are growing in our society. So I think that one is kind of less to do with autism and more to do with just like being a human being in today's world. But if you want to learn more about nature deficit disorder, it's super, super interesting, and I'll include a link to an article about it in the description that you can check out. But the final question this paper brought up for me is everyone a little autistic? Because, well, based on this theory, yeah, they are. I mean, these traits are critical for survival in the wild, so the vast majority of people probably have a small handful. But also, autism as a whole is just a social construct, and this is making me start to wonder if there even is such a thing as autism and not autism, which I guess we've known and talked about before, saying that the autism spectrum actually does look like this and everybody is somewhere on it. It's just the level of how much it gets in your way in daily life that makes it a valid diagnosis or not. And there's definitely people who feel more debilitated by the world than others, and we've seen a strong increase in autism diagnoses of late. I mean, likely because the faster the world moves and the more conformist our society gets, the farther we get away from our natural innate social abilities, so that anybody with an even small bit of struggle that would have been kind of undetectable in the 1600s is completely debilitating today. Or maybe we've just been underdiagnosing the whole time since like the 1600s. That's also probably like a huge part of it.
I don't know. Not to mention that trauma and feeling isolated tend to exacerbate these traits, and because of the, 24-hour news cycle and whatnot, also, the pandemic, everybody is pretty darn traumatized. I mean, to be fair, everybody in history is also traumatized, but now we're starting to really notice it, pay attention. So I really have no idea whether it's worse now than it was, again, in the 1600s, but I do know that we're paying a lot more attention to it now than we used to. I do have to say, however, that even though the answer to is everyone a little bit autistic may technically be yes, there's a lot of nuance to that sentence, and in general, asking that question does still completely invalidate the experiences and struggles of the person involved, because, well, it's not just the traits that you see, it's the entirety of who we are and how we see the world and how we struggle. In an ideal existence, we wouldn't need any labels to name any of this stuff, we would all just be human beings. But in the same way that saying, yeah, I don't see color in regards to race, it's counterproductive, because it completely ignores the biases and the privileges and the struggles that our society has created for us. Saying that everybody's a little autistic is just not helping the cause at all, so don't say it. That's all I ask.
Ideas behind this, not the worst. Explanation of them, a disaster. What I meant to say here is that autism as a specific group of diagnostic criteria as a label is a social construct. We have decided that this list of traits equates to this word. And we have decided that if it's disabling to you, you are that word. And that word has changed over time, and it's going to continue to change over time. That does not mean that the thing does not exist, because in the world in which we currently live, it does need to in order for people to get support. And I do think that diagnostics may be going up to some degree, partially because things are becoming less accessible. The conversation of capitalism and madness is a very real discussion, but my emphasis here made it seem like that's the primary case when it's not. The primary case is a lot of people have been and underdiagnosed until this moment. Yes, everybody has autistic traits because autistic traits are human traits to a certain degree, and you have to have that certain degree of those traits, and they also need to be disabling to you or at least impact your life to some degree in order for it to actually be autism. Would all people benefit from accommodations for sensory needs and for clear information about routines and events? Yes, but that doesn't mean that everybody is autistic or that everybody needs autism accommodations, just that giving more options makes things better for everyone. That's the curb cut effect.
Speaking of nuance and helping the cause, these kinds of theories have been around a while, with people saying, see, we're not defective, we're an advantage because we think out of the box and we're hard workers and we can form relationships and we do have empathy and autism is a superpower. Which does seem like a good argument to make people care about us and whatnot, but what about all of those people who can't work, or the people who can't form solid relationships, or who have messy looking symptoms? Those people are just as important too. And it's important to recognize that some disabilities can be framed as an advantage, and some can't. That doesn't make anybody with any disability less or more important or valuable as a human being than any other. There's evidence of human compassion going back at least 1.5 million years.
I have not a single clue where I got that information or that number from, truly beats me, but I did find an article from an anthropology magazine called sapiens.org that said evidence of human care, on the other hand, goes back at least 1.5 million years to long before humans were anatomically modern. A Homo ergaster female from Kubi4 in Kenya, sorry if I pronounced all of that wrong, dated to about 1.6 million years ago, survived several weeks despite a toxic overaccumulation of vitamin A. She must have been given food and water and protected from predators to live long enough for this disease to leave a record in her bones. I don't think I've ever seen that website before in my life, so I do not know where that original comment came from, but this article then goes on to talk about some other examples of what was clearly the caring for other disabled members of a group, so that's cool. I knew about that in theory, but I didn't know about it as far back, and I think that's really nice. But also I should have cited my source there. What was I doing?
As a species, we are carers. We don't leave people behind if they are ill or cannot walk or anything else. We work together and we help each other to heal. It's just human nature. I mean, in some cultures, people who could not walk were given special status, and then they got to be carried on one of those cool litter things, the chairs that other people carry you in because you're fancy. Yeah. So if you try to use evolution to diminish anybody's experience or say, hey, survival of the fittest, you totally wouldn't have made it, that's downright incorrect, on top of obviously being super offensive and dehumanizing.
Also, fittest does not mean strongest or best or whatever. It means fittest for the specific environment. But again, we should not be using evolution to justify the existence of things, because that's still kind of eugenics, just by a different name. But we're gonna get back to that. We're almost done, I swear.
Now, the last thing, which is really important to talk about, is the now what aspect of this paper. One of the biggest questions both I and the researcher came up at the end of this was, do disorders like this exist in other species? And I've actually had a conversation about this before, because one of my professors happens to study this, specifically looking for autistic traits in mice and potentially the genetic and environmental components that may be causing or leading to those traits. And when discussing his research with a friend, well, we were saying that autism is a human condition. It cannot exist in other animals, and researching stuff like that will just lead to a lot of gross eugenics stuff. You know, coming up with cures, maybe preventions, if that's even possible, though I don't think it is. And is that kind of research something society can handle? Will anything positive be added to our society by researching these things? And when having that discussion, I was like, no, we shouldn't be researching this at all because of ethics. But now, after learning about all of this, I genuinely do want to know if there are any proverbial fish out of water in other species. I don't care what causes it. I just want to know what they do, how they handle it in nature. I mean, who knows what that would even look like in another species? I'm so incredibly curious. But then this also begs the question, when has science gone too far? When should we just stop? And I don't know the answer to that. I do know that autism isn't a fun thing all the time, and I do know that it can be debilitating, and I think maybe doing some research to create some early intervention strategies to raise autistic children in a way that doesn't, you know, traumatize them to the point where they develop lifelong issues and disabilities because of it. But I also don't think that that's what science is really doing with autism research right now. I think it's focusing more on the why and the how do we fix it and the how do we make them normal aspects of the situation. Not the, hey, you're a human and you're struggling because of the environment that we've created. Let's research how to make a world that's a better place for you to live in. So, in conclusion, I guess I'm not quite sure where I stand, and I'm not quite sure what I think about this. But what I do know for sure is that, well, the reason I'm struggling is because I was plopped into the wrong world, and you know what? That's okay, because I'm doing a pretty kick-butt job in this world too. And if I wasn't, well, that's completely understandable. I don't know why I feel more able to forgive myself after reading this, but I definitely feel generally more at peace about this aspect of my identity than I have in a while. I hope that maybe you also feel that way too, or your brain is just exploding with information. I don't know, that's also super incredibly valid. I think this fish out of water idea is very noble and sweet, but it's also kind of an issue because it simplifies a lot of really complicated things. Before we get into the why does this matter, just to wrap up the evolutionary psychology side of it, and I do recommend watching the entire Mooncat video essay when you're bored. EvoPsych is functionally pseudoscience. It's a very well put together video. EvoPsych relies on the idea of how evolution works that is fundamentally not how evolution works. Like, it was perfect, and also it's over now, and also humans are done changing, and also there's a set of normal humans with deviations from that normal. It also assumes that traits can be bred in or out of humankind, which is simply not the case. It assumes that psychology and personality traits and otherwise brain stuff is generally entirely genetic and not influenced by social surroundings at all, which is very false. And also, all their hypotheses are wholly untestable. Much of the field relies on anecdotal evidence and just so stories that it then claims is hard science when it's not. It's just a story with a heavy dose of confirmation bias. It's also important to note that much of this field is used for the sole purpose of trying to use science to justify the way that scientists want the world to be, in line with Western 20th century social norms and beauty standards. Because actually, science tells us we like women to look a certain way because it makes us view them as better caregivers, and so that's why they're desirable. And actually, it's in our genes that men are the hunters and women are the gatherers, despite that concept in and of itself being entirely debunked recently. It's also used to justify things like eugenics, like a lot of eugenics. And while this paper was leaning more toward the affirming of the existence of autistic people, there seems to be a general EvoPsych preoccupation for figuring out why trans people exist, why gay people exist, why disabled people exist. And that might be a noble cause. It might be because those are people who are in our community and they're trying to say, hey, scientifically we make sense, and thus please don't discriminate against us. But first of all, most of the time this research is from the point of view of people who want to eradicate those things or want to understand those things for more nefarious reasons, not from an in-community perspective. And second of all, regardless of what the science says, and really EvoPsych should be in quotation marks if we're going to call it science, if people want to discredit the existence of a minority group, they're going to. It doesn't really matter that much what the science has to say about it, which is why many in-community members doing research about the minorities focus instead on how they can change things for people like them, how we can better support people like them, and not why do I exist? And that is a very important distinction. I talked earlier in this video about how there are 3 reasons why looking at these theories of disabilities as evolutionarily advantageous are important. A, they help us understand that we're not defective and that it's important. B, they help us to understand our behaviors, tendencies, and figure out how to make the world more welcoming to us. And C, they remind us that humans are just animals like any other animal in the world, and we may be different, but we're not necessarily special or evolved out of our animalness. And let's unpack those a little bit more. The first one is the one that I think I got caught up in the most. To
me back then, this paper proved that people like me matter, that we're real, that we deserve to exist, and that we are useful. It made me feel like, actually, I'm not wrong or broken, the world around me is, and has made me this way. But that process in and of itself reeks of internalized ableism. I did not believe that I mattered unless I was useful and I could be explained. I believed that impairment and disorder were inherently bad things. I felt somewhere deep down that I needed science to tell me that I deserved to exist to be able to actually feel that way. And I was in a community that talks about why we deserve to be here, and I talked about the social model of disability on my channel all the time at that point, and yet the way that I talk about this paper, it's clear that I hadn't really internalized any of those things, which makes sense given that particular time in my life in which I made this. If you know, you know. But my reliance on this thing that I knew at the time was theory on top of theory with not a whole lot underneath it, to feel like my existence was justified is indicative of a much wider thing to unpack that clearly I thought I was unpacking, but I really wasn't doing that in the healthiest of ways. It's very funny to me to see how the way I talk about disability completely shifted whenever I started researching for my thesis like 4 months after this. But at the time, this mattered to me, which is why I felt like it was important and worthy to share. And I think that's important to clock and honor, but also critique at the same time. The second reason we talked about was that it helps us understand behaviors and make the world more welcoming to us. I think that can still be the case, not for this study in particular, but like finding better, easier, and simpler language to describe experiences, always the goal. But only if the language is actually better, easier, and simpler. And I think the fact that this idea has not caught on into the lexicon about how people explain autism to other people is very indicative of the fact that it's really none of those things. In-community explanations, not based on pseudoscience, are always going to be a whole lot more useful and helpful and actually make the world a better place for us because they describe our experiences and what it feels like to be us and how to include us better than a theory about why we might exist and how we are viewed from the outside is ever going to be. And then the third thing about humans as animals, I think that's a noble idea as well, but why is it that the majority of time we're acknowledging that humans are animals? It's so that we can understand the outliers of humanity or talk about how to have the most optimal offspring in the grossest way possible. I think we need to acknowledge that humans are animals more than we do, if only so people treat animals more nicely without needing to anthropomorphize them to do so, because we do have a superiority complex that is definitely part of the reason people are very chill with us, just like actively destroying the planet. But I don't think that evolutionary psychology is either the place to do that nor a redeeming quality of the field. It is more of a fluke than anything else. And I again find myself in a situation where I'm realizing that I and many other people got so caught up in wanting a scientific explanation for something because I wouldn't believe it as fact otherwise. I wouldn't feel it as entirely unequivocally true otherwise, even when history and anthropology and other more humanities-oriented fields that also have significant data and basis behind them already have those answers for me, with a lot more to back it up and a lot less eugenics involved. And I also think there comes a point where we need to acknowledge that even regular normal science on autism and things like this is still catching up to where the community is. And that doesn't mean the community is wrong or invalid, because many of the things we all know to be true are not academically published. We know them to be true, and thus they are. And while I often talk about critical thinking and fact-checking as my primary lesson of these videos and of my channel in general, this is also a moment where I feel like I'm more talking about gut checking. Like, we're all very good at clocking why something makes us uncomfortable, why we don't like that thing. Like, it's the ableist language, it's this or that, but we're not very good at going, why does this speak to me? Why am I connecting to this right now? Because that information seems to matter less to us, but it actually matters just as much, because it can be the reason you fall into a pseudoscientific rabbit hole like this one, which isn't comparatively to what other rabbit holes I could have fallen down, the worst thing in the world, like, whatever. It's not super consequential, but it still serves as a valuable lesson. And I also want to be very clear that it's not something that I'm ashamed of, really. I'm more sad that a younger me was in a place where I was so excited for any shred of anything that I held onto this for dear life, and I ignored all of the red flags that I definitely saw, but decided to actively ignore because the thing made me feel good. Because I wanted to feel seen in an academic space, I assumed that science was the only place where that mattered, and so I latched onto this as the thing to help make me feel that way. And now, 3 years later, I'm a historian and I debunk science regularly. Hilarious. Anyway, I'm gonna leave this one here. I hope that you learned something. I hope this gave you something to ponder. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. You're also welcome to like and subscribe, join my Patreon if you so desire, whatever sparks joy for you. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.